Picture this. A devoted mother of 5 tells her family she's going to the grocery store. She kisses her disabled husband goodbye, promises to be back for dinner, and walks out the door with her car keys in hand. That was 14 years ago. She never came home. For over a decade, her children believed the unthinkable, that their mother had simply abandoned them in their darkest hour. They built their lives around this painful truth, creating routines and relationships that helped them cope with what they saw as the ultimate betrayal. But sometimes, the truth is far more sinister than we could ever imagine. Sometimes, what looks like abandonment is actually the greatest act of love a mother can make. This is the story of Dawson, a woman who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that would tear a family apart and bring them back together in the most unexpected way. It's a story about faith when all hope seems lost, about the lengths people will go to protect those they love, and about how sometimes the very thing that breaks us is the same thing that makes us whole again. Before we begin, I want you to ask yourself this question. How far would you go to protect your family? And how long would you wait for someone you love to come home? Dawson's story will challenge everything you think you know about family, sacrifice, and the power of never giving up hope. To understand what happened to Dawson, we need to go back to the beginning, to a family that seemed to have everything until one terrible day changed their lives forever. Dan and Catherine Dawson had built what many would consider the American dream. Married for 15 years, they lived in a modest ranch-style house on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by mature oak trees that had witnessed their children's first steps, birthday parties, and lazy summer afternoons. Dan worked as a supervisor at the local manufacturing plant, steady work with good benefits. Catherine stayed home with their 5 children, creating the kind of household where the smell of fresh-baked cookies could solve almost any problem, and where Sunday dinners brought everyone together around a table that had heard 1,000 stories. Their children were their pride and joy. Ethan, the eldest, was smart and responsible, the kind of boy who helped his younger siblings with homework and never had to be told twice to do his chores. Mark, 2 years younger, was the practical one, already talking about college and business degrees at the age of 12. Leah was their only daughter, creative and thoughtful, with a love of books that kept her reading under the covers long after bedtime. Then came Ellie, the family peacemaker, who could sense tension in a room before anyone else and always knew exactly what to say to make things better. And finally, little Aldi, barely walking when our story begins, the baby who brought out the gentlest side of everyone in the family. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. Dan was rushing to get ready for work. They were short-staffed at the plant, and he'd been putting in extra hours to help make ends meet. Catherine was in the kitchen, packing lunchboxes and making sure everyone had their backpacks, when they heard the sound that would haunt them forever. A crash, a scream, then silence. Dan had suffered a massive stroke at the top of the stairs. The same stairs he'd climbed thousands of times before suddenly became his enemy, sending him tumbling down 15 steps, his body crashing against the hardwood floor with a sound that brought Catherine running. The next few hours were a blur of ambulances, emergency rooms, and doctors using words like extensive damage and permanent disability. When the dust settled, Dan Dawson, the man who had been the steady provider for his family, was paralyzed from the waist down, confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. But the real nightmare was just beginning. The medical bills started arriving within weeks. Despite having what they thought was good insurance, the reality of Dan's condition quickly became clear. Insurance companies are very good at finding reasons not to pay for things. Physical therapy, specialized equipment, home modifications to accommodate a wheelchair. The costs added up faster than Catherine could count. Within 6 months, they had exhausted their savings. Within a year, they had maxed out every credit card, taken out a second mortgage, and borrowed against Dan's retirement account. Catherine, who had never worked outside the home, suddenly found herself filling out job applications while caring for a disabled husband and 5 children. But even with Catherine working part-time at the local grocery store, they were drowning. The bills kept coming, and the phone calls from debt collectors became a daily torment. Catherine would wait until the children were in bed before opening the mail, sitting alone at the kitchen table, adding up numbers that never seemed to add up to anything but despair. Dan, meanwhile, was fighting his own battles. The proud man, who had once lifted his children onto his shoulders, now struggled with the simplest tasks. Depression settled over him like a heavy blanket, and some days he wondered if his family would be better off without him. It was during this dark period that Catherine began to change. The woman who had once filled their home with laughter became quiet, withdrawn. She would disappear for hours at a time, claiming she was looking for work or running errands, but returning home with a tension that seemed to follow her through the door. The children noticed, of course. Ethan, now 16 and feeling the weight of being the oldest, tried to take on more responsibility. Mark threw himself into his studies as if good grades could somehow fix their family's problems. Leah retreated into her books, while Ellie tried desperately to maintain the peace that was slowly slipping away from their household. And little Aldi, too young to understand what was happening, only knew that Mommy seemed sad all the time now. None of them could have imagined that Catherine was fighting a battle they couldn't see, a battle that would ultimately cost her everything. It was a Thursday in October when Catherine Dawson walked out of her house for the last time. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, and there was a crispness in the air that promised winter wasn't far behind. She had seemed different that morning, quieter than usual, but also strangely calm. She made breakfast for the family, as she always did, helped Aldi get dressed, and reminded the older children about their after-school activities. She kissed Dan goodbye, lingering just a moment longer than usual, and told him she was going to the grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner. "I'll be back soon," she said, grabbing her purse and car keys. Those would be the last words her family would ever hear her speak. When the children came home from school that afternoon, they found Dan in his wheelchair in the living room, staring out the window with a worried expression. Catherine should have been back hours ago. The grocery store was only 20 minutes away, and she had never been gone this long without calling. By dinner time, Dan was making phone calls. He called the grocery store. They had no record of Catherine being there that day. He called her few remaining friends, her sister in the next state, even the local hospitals. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. By midnight, Dan was calling the police. The investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Catherine's car was missing along with her, but there were no signs of struggle at the house, no evidence of foul play. Her purse was gone, but she had left behind her wedding ring on the bathroom counter, a detail that would haunt Dan for years to come. Detective Richard Vans was assigned to the case. A veteran officer with 23 years on the force, he had seen his share of missing persons cases. Most of them, he knew from experience, ended in one of 3 ways. The person was found dead, the person was found alive but didn't want to be found, or the person was never found at all. In cases like this, Detective Vans explained gently to Dan during one of their early meetings, we have to consider all possibilities. Sometimes people leave because they feel overwhelmed. Sometimes they're running from something we don't know about. And sometimes... He didn't need to finish the sentence. The first few weeks were filled with search parties, missing person flyers, and local news coverage. The community rallied around the Dawson family. Neighbors brought casseroles, friends organized fundraisers, and volunteers combed the woods and fields around their town looking for any sign of Catherine. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, the search efforts began to fade. The news crews moved on to other stories. The volunteers returned to their own lives, and slowly, painfully, the Dawson family was forced to confront a terrible possibility. Catherine might not be coming home. The children each processed this reality in their own way. Ethan, now 17 and on the verge of graduation, made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of going to college as planned, he got a job at a local warehouse to help support the family. Someone had to step up, he reasoned, and as the oldest, that responsibility fell to him. Mark, 15 and academically gifted, threw himself even deeper into his studies. If he could get scholarships, if he could become successful, maybe he could eventually help his family recover from this financial and emotional devastation. Leah, 13, and struggling with the loss of the mother who had been her closest confidant, began to harden herself against further disappointment. If you don't expect good things to happen, she learned, you can't be hurt when they don't. Ellie, 11 and naturally empathetic, became her father's primary caregiver. She learned to help him with his medications, to cook simple meals, and to be the emotional support that Dan desperately needed as he fought his own battles with depression and guilt. And Aldi, just 2 years old when his mother disappeared, would grow up with only the faintest memories of the woman who had brought him into the world. But perhaps the most devastating realization came gradually, as the family was forced to confront the financial evidence that Catherine had left behind. As Dan gained access to accounts and paperwork that Catherine had been handling, a troubling picture began to emerge. There were loans he didn't know about, credit cards taken out in Catherine's name alone, cash advances and payday loans with interest rates that bordered on predatory. In her desperation to keep the family afloat, Catherine had been borrowing money from increasingly dangerous sources. The final blow came 6 months after her disappearance, when a man in an expensive suit arrived at their door with legal papers. Catherine had apparently borrowed $15,000 from a private lending company, using the house as collateral. The terms of the loan were devastating. If the money wasn't repaid within a year, the lender could foreclose on their home. Dan stared at the papers in disbelief. $15,000 might as well have been $15 million. He had no way to repay such a sum. And Catherine, the only person who might have known the details of this arrangement, was gone. It was then that the terrible thought first entered Dan's mind. Had Catherine left them voluntarily? Had the pressure of their financial situation, combined with his disability and the overwhelming responsibility of caring for 5 children, finally become too much for her to bear? The idea was almost too painful to consider. But as months passed, with no word from Catherine, no sign that she was in trouble or needed help, Dan began to accept what seemed like the only logical explanation. Catherine had reached her breaking point and walked away from her old life to start fresh somewhere else. The children, each in their own time and in their own way, came to the same heartbreaking conclusion. Their mother, the woman who had bandaged their scraped knees, read them bedtime stories, and promised to always be there for them, had chosen to abandon them in their darkest hour. All of them, except Ethan. While his family slowly accepted the painful reality of abandonment, Ethan Dawson held on to something that everyone else called denial, but that he knew was truth. His mother would never have left them willingly. It wasn't just sentiment or wishful thinking. Ethan had memories, specific, concrete moments that he couldn't reconcile with the idea that Catherine had simply walked away from her life. He remembered the night before she disappeared, when she had come into his room to say goodnight. It was something she had done when he was younger, but had stopped as he got older. That night, though, she sat on the edge of his bed and told him how proud she was of the young man he was becoming. "You're going to do great things, Ethan," she had said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Whatever happens, I need you to know that everything I do because I love you and your father and your brothers and sisters more than my own life." At the time, it had seemed like a mother's typical encouragement. Looking back, It felt like a goodbye. Then there was the matter of the wedding ring. Catherine never took off her wedding ring, not to do dishes, not to garden, not even when she was baking and her hands got covered in flour. The fact that she had left it behind didn't suggest someone planning a new life with another man. It suggested someone who knew she might not be coming home and wanted to leave something meaningful behind. But perhaps most convincing to Ethan was something only he had witnessed. About a week before Catherine disappeared, he had come home early from school with a fever. As he walked up to the house, he saw his mother standing in the driveway, talking on her cell phone. Her back was to him, but her posture was tense, frightened. "I told you I need more time," he heard her say, her voice strained with desperation. "Please, just give me another month. I'll figure something out. I promise." There was a pause, then Catherine's voice again, barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. If something happens to me, what about my children? What about my family?" Ethan had quietly retreated, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a private conversation. When Catherine came inside a few minutes later, she seemed shaken but tried to act normal. When Ethan asked if everything was okay, she forced a smile and said she was just dealing with some bill collectors. For years after Catherine's disappearance, Ethan would replay that conversation in his mind. The fear in his mother's voice, the way she had pleaded for more time. Her concern about what would happen to her family if something happened to her. None of it fit with someone planning to abandon her responsibilities. But as the years passed, Ethan found himself increasingly alone in his convictions. His family needed to move on, to heal, to build new lives from the wreckage of their old one. His insistence that there was more to the story, that Catherine was somehow in trouble rather than selfish, became a source of tension at every family gathering. Dan, overwhelmed by his own guilt and depression, couldn't bear to hope that Catherine might still be alive somewhere, needing help that he was powerless to provide. It was easier somehow to believe that she had chosen to leave than to imagine her trapped somewhere, calling out for a rescue that would never come. Mark and Leah, practical by nature, looked at the evidence logically. Catherine had been under enormous stress. She had been secretive about their financial situation, and she had vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine trip to the store. The simplest explanation was usually the correct one. And the simplest explanation was that she had reached her breaking point. Ellie, who had taken on the role of family peacekeeper, begged Ethan to let it go. Every time he brought up their mother, every time he questioned the official narrative, it reopened wounds that the rest of the family was trying desperately to heal. Even Aldi, who had no real memories of Catherine, seemed to sense the pain that came with discussing her. As he grew older, he learned not to ask questions about the mother he had lost as a toddler. But Ethan couldn't let it go. As the years passed, he developed what his family called an obsession, but what he knew was a mission. He read everything he could about missing persons cases. He learned about human trafficking, about predatory lending, about the various ways that vulnerable people could disappear from their lives. He stayed in contact with Detective Vans, calling periodically to ask if there had been any new developments in his mother's case. The detective, a kind man who understood a son's need for answers, always took Ethan's calls, even though he had little new information to share. Missing persons cases like your mother's, Detective Vans explained during one of their conversations, they usually stay cold unless new evidence surfaces. After this many years, the chances of finding new evidence become very slim. But Ethan never stopped looking. He drove past the grocery store where his mother was supposed to have gone on the day she disappeared, studying the parking lot and surrounding area as if he might spot some clue that trained investigators had missed. He researched every private lending company in their area, trying to understand who Catherine might have borrowed money from and what might have happened when she couldn't repay it. He even, much to his family's dismay, spent his own money hiring a private investigator for 6 months. The investigator, a former police detective named Maria Santos, was sympathetic to Ethan's cause, but ultimately reached the same conclusions as the original investigation. Catherine Dawson had most likely disappeared voluntarily. "I've seen this before," Santos told Ethan gently when she returned his case files. "People get trapped in situations where they feel like they have no good options. They see leaving as the only way to protect their families from whatever trouble they've gotten themselves into. It doesn't mean she loved you any less. It might mean she loved you more than you realize." But Ethan wasn't convinced. Something deep in his gut, some instinct that he couldn't explain or rationalize, told him that his mother was out there somewhere, not by choice but by force. And if there was even a chance that she was alive and in trouble, he couldn't rest until he found her. This unwavering faith would eventually cost him relationships. He dated occasionally over the years, but few women could understand his preoccupation with a mother who had been gone for over a decade. Friends grew tired of hearing about conspiracy theories and alternative explanations for Catherine's disappearance. Even his career suffered. Instead of pursuing the engineering degree he had planned before his mother's disappearance, Ethan took a series of blue-collar jobs that gave him the flexibility to investigate leads when they arose. He became skilled at construction work, warehouse operations, and security, jobs that paid the bills but never fulfilled his potential. His family watched this with a mixture of love and frustration. They could see how his inability to let go of the past was limiting his future. But they also knew that Ethan's determination came from a place of love so deep that it couldn't be reasoned away. And so, for 14 years, Ethan Dawson lived with a truth that no one else would accept. His mother was out there somewhere, waiting for someone to find her. "14 years after Catherine Dawson's disappearance, the family had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. Every Sunday, without fail, all 5 children would gather at their father's house for dinner. It was sacred time. No phones, no outside distractions. Just the family that had learned to hold itself together despite the missing piece at its center. Dan, now 50 and showing the wear of 14 years in a wheelchair, still lived in the same house where Catherine had said goodbye for the last time. He had stubbornly refused all suggestions that he move somewhere more manageable. This was where his family came home to, he insisted, and he wouldn't give that up. The house itself bore the marks of adaptation and time. Ramps had been installed, doorways widened, and the entire first floor reconfigured to accommodate Dan's wheelchair. But Catherine's presence still lingered in unexpected places. Her coffee mug still sat in the kitchen cabinet. Her reading glasses remained on the bedside table, and her apron hung on its hook by the stove, as if she might walk through the door at any moment and start preparing dinner. On this particular Sunday in late autumn, the family gathered as they always did. Ellie, now 23 and working as a manager at a local bookstore, had taken over most of the cooking duties. She moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, preparing the kind of meal that Catherine would have made: lasagna, garlic bread, and a salad that no one would eat, but that felt necessary for completeness. Mark, 25 and working as an accountant, arrived precisely on time, as he always did. He had married 2 years earlier, a small ceremony that felt both joyful and melancholy, with Catherine's absence hanging over every moment. His wife, Sarah, had tried to attend these family dinners initially, but the weight of their collective grief had proved too much for an outsider to bear. Leah, 23 and managing a small independent bookstore, brought flowers from her garden. She had inherited Catherine's green thumb and had created a beautiful space in her own apartment filled with plants that she tended with the same care their mother had once given to her family. Aldi, now 15 and the only one who had no real memories of Catherine, attended these dinners with the dutiful affection of someone honoring a tradition he didn't fully understand. He was a good kid, athletic, popular at school, and seemingly well-adjusted despite growing up without a mother. But sometimes Dan would catch him staring at Catherine's photograph with an expression of profound loss for something he had never really had. The ritual was always the same. gather in the living room while Ellie finished preparing dinner, catch up on the week's events. Then move to the dining room, where Catherine's chair remained permanently empty, but where the conversation flowed around her absence like water around a stone. But on this Sunday, Ethan was late. He said he'd be here by 6, Ellie said, checking her phone for the third time as the lasagna began to cool on the stove. Should we start without him? We always wait, Dan said firmly. It was one of the few ironclad rules of their Sunday dinners. No one ate until everyone was present. It was a small gesture, but it reinforced the idea that they were still a complete family, even when they didn't feel complete. When Ethan finally burst through the door at 20 minutes past 6, he looked different, disheveled, excited, and carrying an energy that immediately put everyone on alert. His normally neat appearance was askew, his tie loosened, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that reminded them all, painfully, of Catherine. "Sorry I'm late," he said breathlessly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. For 14 years, Catherine's blue sedan had been as missing as Catherine herself, a detail that had always bothered investigators and family members alike. Cars didn't just disappear, especially not in small towns where everyone knew everyone else's business. Where? The question came from Leah, and it was barely above a whisper. Miller's Lake, Ethan replied, pulling out his phone to show them the photos that Detective Vans had sent. A helicopter crew spotted it during a drug trafficking investigation. It was underwater, completely submerged. They think it's been there since she disappeared. The family stared at the photos, murky images of a sediment-covered vehicle being pulled from the dark water of Miller's Lake, a remote body of water about 30 minutes from their home. It was the kind of place teenagers went to drink beer and couples went to be alone, isolated, surrounded by woods, with very little traffic. Was she? Ellie couldn't finish the question, but everyone knew what she was asking. No, Ethan said quickly. No body. The car was empty when they pulled it up. This information should have been reassuring, but somehow it made everything worse. An empty car at the bottom of a lake raised more questions than it answered. How did it get there? Who had driven it there? And where was Catherine? Mark, ever practical, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. So she drove to Miller's Lake and what? Abandoned the car there and left with someone else? That actually supports what we've always thought about her leaving voluntarily. But Ethan shook his head vigorously. There's more. Detective Vans said the car was deliberately sunk. The windows were rolled down to let water in, and they found things inside, personal items that didn't belong to Mom. What kind of personal items? Dan asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Ethan consulted his phone again, reading from Detective Vans's messages. Men's sunglasses with the name Ronald carved into them, a baseball cap, a receipt with a man's name on it, and, he paused, clearly struggling with this next part, and there was a water-damaged photograph of Mom, but it was tucked inside a plastic bag like someone was trying to preserve it. The implications of this evidence hung in the air like smoke. To most of the family, it confirmed their worst fears. Catherine had been involved with another man, had planned her disappearance carefully, and had staged the sinking of her car to make it look like something had happened to her. But for Ethan, these details raised different questions. Why would Catherine preserve a photograph of herself if she was planning to start a new life? Why sink the car at all instead of just leaving it somewhere to be found? And who was this Ronald person? I want to go see it, Dan said suddenly, surprising everyone. I want to see the car. Ellie immediately protested. Dad, I don't think that's a good idea. It's getting late, and you know how hard it is to get your wheelchair across uneven ground. But Dan's jaw was set in a way they all recognized. The same stubborn determination that had kept him fighting through 14 years of physical and emotional pain. I need to see it, Ellie. After all this time, I need to see where this happened. And so, despite their reservations, despite the gathering darkness and the difficult terrain, the Dawson family found themselves driving to Miller's Lake on a Sunday evening, following directions that would lead them to the place where their mother's car had rested for 14 years under 20 feet of dark water. None of them could have predicted what they would discover there, or how this night would shatter everything they thought they knew about Catherine's disappearance. As they drove through the familiar streets of their small town, past the high school where they had all been students, past the grocery store where Catherine was supposed to have gone on the day she vanished, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were finally approaching the truth after 14 years of living with questions. But the truth, when it finally revealed itself, would be more shocking than any of them could have imagined. Miller's Lake at night was a different world from the daylight recreation spot that local families knew. Without the cheerful sounds of swimmers and boaters, the lake took on an ominous quality, dark water that seemed to swallow light, surrounded by trees that whispered secrets in the evening breeze. When the Dawson family arrived, the scene was still active with law enforcement. Floodlights had been set up around the area where Catherine's car had been recovered, casting harsh white light across the muddy shoreline. The sedan itself sat on a flatbed trailer, water still dripping from its corroded frame like tears. Detective Vans spotted them immediately and walked over to their modified SUV. At 57, he looked older than his years, the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much human tragedy. But his eyes were kind as he greeted the family, and there was genuine sympathy in his voice. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see this," he said to Dan as they helped transfer him from the vehicle to his wheelchair. "But I understand the need for closure." The detective led them as close to the recovered vehicle as the muddy terrain would allow. Up close, the damage from 14 years underwater was even more apparent. The blue paint had faded to a sickly green, and aquatic plants clung to the bumpers like decoration. The interior was a tangle of mud, silt, and unidentifiable debris. "We've processed most of the evidence already," Detective Vans explained, pulling out a sealed evidence bag. "But I wanted you to see this in person." Inside the bag was a water-damaged photograph, Catherine smiling at the camera, her hair shorter than they remembered it, wearing a sweater they didn't recognize. But it was unmistakably her, and it was unmistakably recent, or at least more recent than 14 years ago. Dan reached out with trembling hands to hold the evidence bag, staring at the image of his wife. "She looks different," he said quietly. "Older, but also," he struggled to find the words. "Sad," Ellie finished for him, leaning over his shoulder to get a better look. "She looks sad, Dad." Detective Vans nodded. "We found that in the glove compartment, sealed in a plastic bag along with some documents. The documents are too water damaged to read completely, but our lab was able to make out some interesting details." He pulled out another evidence bag containing what appeared to be a lease agreement or contract. The paper was warped and stained, but portions of text were still visible. "This appears to be some kind of rental agreement," the detective continued. "The signature at the bottom, does that look familiar to any of you?" Ethan studied the document carefully, and his heart nearly stopped. Despite the water damage, despite the years of submersion, he recognized his mother's distinctive handwriting immediately. The same careful loops and flourishes that had signed his school permission slips, written grocery lists, and left notes in his lunchbox. "That's Mom's signature," he said with certainty. "But the name on the contract, it's not Catherine Dawson." Detective Vans nodded gravely. "The name appears to be Elizabeth Carter. The contract is dated approximately 3 months after your mother's disappearance." The implications of this discovery hit the family like a physical blow. If Catherine had signed a lease agreement 3 months after she vanished, it meant she had been alive, somewhere, using a false identity. But why? And where had she been living under this assumed name? "There's more," Detective Vans continued, though his reluctance to share additional information was evident. "The landlord listed on this agreement is a company called Dawson Properties. That name might not mean anything to you, but it's familiar to law enforcement." He paused, clearly weighing how much to reveal to a grieving family. Raymond Doss was a businessman who operated on the fringes of legality. His companies were investigated several times for predatory lending practices, money laundering, and other financial crimes. He died 3 years ago, but his operations were taken over by his son, Harvey. The name Doss sent a chill through Ethan that he couldn't explain. Something about it felt significant. Dangerous, like a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was trying to solve. "You think Mom was involved with these people?" Mark asked, his accounting background making him immediately suspicious of any business described as operating on the fringes of legality. "It's possible," Detective Vans replied carefully. "Based on what your father has told us about your family's financial situation after his accident, it's conceivable that your mother might have sought help from alternative lending sources when traditional banks wouldn't approve her for loans." Dan's face had gone pale. For 14 years, he had blamed himself for Catherine's disappearance, believing that his disability and their subsequent financial struggles had driven her away. But this new information suggested something far worse, that Catherine might have gotten involved with dangerous people in her desperate attempt to save their family from financial ruin. "What happens now?" Leah asked, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Do you investigate this Doss connection?" Detective Vans sighed, and his answer revealed the harsh realities of police work in a small department with limited resources. "We'll follow up on the leads we have, but I have to be honest with you. This is a 14-year-old case with very few concrete leads. Unless we find additional evidence that clearly indicates foul play, the department doesn't have the resources to mount a full-scale investigation." "So that's it?" Ethan demanded, his frustration boiling over. "You find evidence that Mom was alive months after she supposedly abandoned us, that she was using a fake name and dealing with criminals, and you're just going to file it away and forget about it?" "Ethan," the detective said gently, "I understand your frustration, but the evidence we've found could support multiple theories. Yes, it's possible that your mother was coerced into working for Doss's organization. But it's also possible that she sought them out voluntarily, looking for a way to disappear and start a new life." The detective gestured toward the recovered car. The fact that this vehicle was deliberately sunk suggests planning, preparation. Someone wanted it hidden, wanted to control the narrative of what happened to your mother. That level of premeditation could indicate either that she was being controlled by others or that she was controlling her own disappearance. As the family absorbed this information, Detective Vans reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "I've prepared copies of all the evidence we've recovered for your family. Photos of the car, the documents we found, our preliminary analysis. I thought you might want to have them." Ethan reached for the envelope immediately, but the detective held it back for a moment. "Before I give you this," Detective Vans said seriously, "I need to warn you about something. If Raymond Doss's organization was involved in your mother's disappearance, and if they're still operating under his son Harvey, then digging into this could be dangerous. These aren't people who appreciate attention from law enforcement or from families asking questions. The warning should have been enough to make any reasonable person step back, reconsider, and let the professionals handle whatever investigation might follow." But Ethan Dawson had spent 14 years being reasonable, and it had gotten him nowhere. "I understand the risks," he said firmly, taking the envelope from the detective's hands. "But I can't just walk away from this, not when we're finally getting answers." Detective Vans studied Ethan's face for a long moment, recognizing the determination that both impressed and worried him. "If you're going to look into this," he said finally, "promise me you won't do anything alone, and promise me you'll call me immediately if you find anything, or if anyone approaches you about your investigation." Ethan nodded, though they both knew it was a promise that might be difficult to keep when the truth was finally within reach. As the family prepared to leave Miller's Lake, each of them carrying the weight of this new information in their own way, none of them could have predicted that within 24 hours, Ethan's determination to find the truth would lead him directly into the dangerous world that had swallowed their mother 14 years ago. The lake, which had kept Catherine's secrets for so long, had finally given up one piece of the puzzle. But as Ethan would soon discover, it was just the beginning of a mystery that was far more complex and dangerous than any of them had imagined. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the manila envelope spread across his kitchen table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that had been scattered for 14 years. The harsh fluorescent light cast shadows across the water-damaged documents, making his mother's signature look ghostly, almost ethereal. He had read through every page 3 times, studying each detail with the intensity of a detective. The lease agreement with Elizabeth Carter's name was the key. He was certain of it, but the address listed on the document was in an industrial area he wasn't familiar with, and the rental company, Dawson Properties, had no online presence that he could find. Sleep was impossible. Every time Ethan closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face in that water-damaged photograph, older, sadder, but unmistakably alive years after she was supposed to have disappeared. The implications were staggering. If Catherine had been alive 3 months after her disappearance, using a false identity and renting property from a criminal organization, then everything they thought they knew about her vanishing was wrong. By 3 a.m., Ethan had made a decision that would have terrified his family if they had known about it. He was going to visit the address on that lease agreement. He was going to find out what connection his mother had to Dawson Properties, and he was going to do it alone. Detective Vance had warned him about the dangers of investigating Raymond Dawson's organization, but Ethan couldn't wait for an official police investigation that might never happen. 14 years of waiting had taught him that sometimes, if you want answers, you have to find them yourself. The next morning, Ethan called in sick to his construction job and spent the day researching everything he could find about Raymond Dawson and his business operations. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Raymond Dawson hadn't just been a businessman operating on the fringes of legality. He had been the head of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that specialized in exploiting desperate people. His companies offered loans to individuals who couldn't qualify for traditional bank financing, but the terms were predatory and designed to trap borrowers in cycles of debt they could never escape. When people defaulted on their loans, and they almost always defaulted, Dawson's organization didn't just take their collateral, they took the people themselves, forcing them to work off their debts in conditions that amounted to modern slavery. The operations were carefully designed to stay below law enforcement's radar, targeting vulnerable individuals who were unlikely to be missed or whose families were too frightened to report them. According to news articles from several years ago, the FBI had investigated Dawson's operations multiple times, but had never been able to gather enough evidence for successful prosecutions. Witnesses had a tendency to disappear or refuse to testify, and Dawson's lawyers were skilled at exploiting legal loopholes and technicalities. Raymond Dawson had died 3 years ago, but according to the articles Ethan found, his son Harvey had taken over the business operations. If anything, Harvey was reportedly more ruthless and more careful than his father had been. As the pieces began to fall into place, Ethan started to understand what might have happened to his mother. Desperate to find money for Dan's medical bills, Catherine had likely borrowed from Dawson's organization when no legitimate lender would help her. When she couldn't repay the loan, they had taken her as collateral, forcing her to work for them under the false identity of Elizabeth Carter. The thought of his mother trapped in such conditions for 14 years filled Ethan with a rage so intense it was difficult to breathe. The address on Elizabeth Carter's lease agreement led Ethan to a part of town he had never seen before. A maze of industrial buildings, abandoned factories, and storage facilities that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. Streetlights were sparse, and the few that worked cast sickly yellow pools of light that seemed to emphasize the shadows rather than illuminate them. When Ethan finally found the building, his heart sank. It looked abandoned, a weathered single-story structure with a faded sign that read, "Quality Furniture Refurbishing." The windows were covered from the inside, preventing any view of the interior, and weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot's asphalt. But as Ethan sat in his car, studying the building, he noticed signs of recent activity. An old pickup truck was parked by a side entrance, and a dim light glowed from somewhere within the structure. Someone was inside. For several minutes, Ethan debated his next move. Detective Vance had warned him about the dangers of investigating Dawson's organization alone, and everything about this place radiated menace. But the thought of his mother, possibly trapped somewhere by the people who operated from this building, gave him the courage to get out of his car. As he approached the building, trying to look casual despite his racing heart, a figure emerged from the side entrance. It was an older man, perhaps in his early 60s, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged here. The man noticed Ethan immediately and began walking toward him with a measured, deliberate pace. Ethan's instinct was to run, but something told him this might be his only chance to learn something about this place and its connection to his mother. "Evening," the man said, his voice surprisingly friendly. "You lost? Not many folks find themselves out here this time of night, unless they took a wrong turn." Ethan had prepared a story on the drive over. "I think I might have missed a turn," he replied, trying to sound casual. "But as I was driving by, I noticed this place. I run a small business, and I've been looking for warehouse space in the area. I know it's late, but I saw the light on and thought I'd check it out." The man, who appeared to be some kind of security guard, took a sip of his coffee and studied Ethan with sharp, intelligent eyes. "This ain't for rent, if that's what you're wondering. Family business." "Who owns it?" Ethan asked, trying to sound merely curious. "Harvey Doss," the guard replied, and Ethan's heart nearly stopped. "Son of Raymond Doss. You ever heard of Raymond Doss?" Ethan shook his head, feigning ignorance. "Should I have?" The guard raised an eyebrow. "Raymond owned half the industrial property in this area, passed away a few years back, and his son Harvey took over the business. Private man, doesn't deal directly with folks, especially not those who show up unannounced after hours." "Is there someone else I could talk to then?" Ethan pressed. "A manager or representative, maybe?" The guard seemed to consider this for a moment. "Tell you what, come back tomorrow during business hours. Ask for Ronald. He handles Harvey's affairs here." The name Ronald hit Ethan like a physical blow. Ronald, the same name that had been carved into the sunglasses found in his mother's car. "Ronald," Ethan repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "He'll definitely be here tomorrow? He reports to me, and I got his number. I can let him know tonight that someone's interested." "That would be great," Ethan said, deliberately not offering his own contact information. "I'll just stop by tomorrow." The guard nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. "Ronald likes to conduct business face-to-face. Just so you know, he doesn't appreciate folks bringing outsiders or partners to these initial meetings. Likes to size people up one-on-one first." "I understand," Ethan replied. "I'll come alone." He was about to return to his car when a thought struck him. A calculated risk that could either provide crucial information or put him in serious danger. "One more thing," Ethan called out to the guard, who had already begun walking away. "I don't suppose you've ever heard of a woman named Elizabeth Carter around this area?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. The guard's entire demeanor changed, his shoulders stiffening and his face hardening into an expressionless mask. The friendly security man vanished, replaced by someone much more dangerous. "You need to leave," he said flatly, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Now." But Ethan, realizing he had struck a nerve, pressed further, despite the warning bells going off in his head. "I just need to know if..." The guard moved with surprising speed, closing the distance to Ethan's car in 2 long strides. He placed his weathered hands on the edge of Ethan's partially open window and leaned in, his face inches away. "You want ghosts?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "You're in the right place. She didn't want to be found." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "What do you mean? Who didn't want to be found?" The guard straightened up, rapping his knuckles against the doorframe. "If you want to talk about that too, come see Ronald tomorrow, but I'd advise against it." He knocked on the car frame once more. "You'd better go now." Ethan hesitated only briefly before putting the car in reverse. As he backed away slowly, he watched the guard remain standing in the same spot, tracking him with cold eyes until Ethan turned the car around and drove away. His mind was racing as he navigated back toward town. The guard had clearly recognized Elizabeth Carter's name. His reaction confirmed that his mother had some connection to this place. But what did he mean by ghosts? And why would he say she didn't want to be found? For the first time in 14 years, Ethan felt he was finally on the trail of something real. Something that might explain what had happened to his mother. But he also understood, with crystal clarity, that he was now dealing with people who were far more dangerous than he had imagined. The question was, should he heed Detective Vance's warning and turn this information over to the police? Or should he keep pushing forward on his own, knowing that tomorrow's meeting with Ronald might be his only chance to learn the truth? As Ethan drove through the empty streets toward his apartment, he knew he had already made his decision. After 14 years of questions, he was finally close to answers, and no amount of danger was going to make him turn back now. Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the guard's voice. She didn't want to be found. The words echoed in his mind, raising questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. By morning, he had made a decision that would have horrified his family if they had known about it. He was going to return to the warehouse and meet with Ronald, despite every instinct screaming that it was dangerous. But first, he was going to call Detective Vance. "You did what?" Detective Vance's voice was sharp with alarm when Ethan explained his nighttime visit to the warehouse. "Ethan, I specifically warned you about the dangers of investigating these people alone." "I know, but I learned something important," Ethan insisted. "The guard recognized my mother's fake name immediately, and there's someone named Ronald there, the same name that was carved into the sunglasses found in Mom's car. This can't be a coincidence." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Detective Vance spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "What exactly did this guard say about Elizabeth Carter?" Ethan repeated the conversation word for word, including the cryptic comment about ghosts and not wanting to be found. Detective Vance listened without interruption, and Ethan could hear him taking notes. "This is significant information," the detective admitted finally, "but it also confirms my worst fears about how dangerous this investigation could become. You cannot go back there alone, Ethan. If these people are involved in your mother's disappearance, they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their operation." "But they've agreed to meet with me," Ethan argued. "If I don't show up, we might never get another chance to learn what happened to Mom. We'll send in an undercover officer," Detective Vance said firmly. "Set up surveillance. Do this properly with backup and safety protocols." Ethan knew the detective was right from a safety perspective, but he also knew how these things worked. Police investigations moved slowly, required warrants and approvals and careful planning. By the time law enforcement was ready to move, Ronald and Harvey Dawson could disappear, taking any evidence of Catherine's fate with them. "Detective," Ethan said carefully, "how long would it take to set up an undercover operation?" The pause that followed told Ethan everything he needed to know. "Several days, possibly weeks," Detective Vance admitted. "We'd need to coordinate with multiple departments, get approval from supervisors, develop a proper operational plan. They're expecting me today," Ethan said. "If I don't show up, they'll know something's wrong. This might be our only chance." The internal debate that followed was one of the most difficult of Ethan's life. Every rational part of his mind agreed with Detective Vance. Going to that warehouse alone was incredibly dangerous. But the part of him that had spent 14 years believing his mother was still alive somewhere, waiting for rescue, couldn't bear the thought of missing this opportunity. In the end, it was the thought of Catherine trapped somewhere for 14 years that made his decision for him. "I'm going," Ethan told the detective. "But I'll be careful. I'll wear a wire if you have one. Keep my phone on. Whatever you think, will help keep me safe. Detective Vans tried for another 20 minutes to talk him out of it, but eventually recognized the determination in Ethan's voice, the same unwavering faith that had kept him searching for his mother when everyone else had given up. "If you're going to do this against my advice," the detective said finally, "then we're going to do it as safely as possible. Meet me at the station in an hour. We'll wire you up and have backup teams positioned nearby. And Ethan, if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you get out of there immediately." An hour later, Ethan sat in a police station while a technician fitted him with a small recording device and an emergency transmitter. Detective Vans went over the plan repeatedly. Ethan would go to the warehouse, try to learn what he could about Elizabeth Carter and Ronald, but would not take any unnecessary risks. "Remember," Detective Vans said as they finished the preparations, "these people are professionals. They're experts at reading people and detecting deception. Don't try to be clever or ask leading questions. Just see what they're willing to tell you about warehouse rental, and let them bring up anything about Elizabeth Carter if they choose to." As Ethan drove back toward the industrial district, he tried to calm his nerves by focusing on his mother. Somewhere out there, Catherine might still be alive, still trapped by the same people he was about to confront. After 14 years of wondering and waiting, he was finally close to answers. But as the warehouse came into view, Ethan realized that some answers come with a price that's almost too high to pay. When Ethan arrived at the warehouse the next afternoon, the scene was completely different from the night before. The building looked deserted. No pickup truck, no lights, no signs of activity. For a moment, he wondered if he had come to the wrong place or if the meeting had been called off. But as he sat in his car, debating his next move, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The building wasn't just empty, it had been hastily evacuated. The front door stood slightly ajar, and through his windshield, Ethan could see papers scattered across the parking lot, as if someone had left in a hurry and dropped things along the way. Detective Vans's voice crackled through the concealed radio. "What's your status? Ethan? What do you see?" "The place looks abandoned," Ethan whispered, not wanting to be overheard, even though there seemed to be no one around. "Like they left in a hurry." "Get out of there now," Detective Vans commanded. "If they've cleared out overnight, it means they know someone's investigating them." But Ethan's curiosity overrode his caution. He had come too far to turn back without learning anything. "I'm going to take a quick look inside. The door's open." "Absolutely not. That's exactly what they want you to do." Against Detective Vans's protests, Ethan got out of his car and approached the building. The scattered papers in the parking lot turned out to be shipping manifests and warehouse inventories. Documents that revealed this had been much more than a simple storage facility. The interior of the warehouse was a revelation. Though most of the equipment had been removed, Ethan could see the layout of what had clearly been a sophisticated operation. There were partitioned areas that looked like they had been used as sleeping quarters. Workstations with computer cables still snaking across the floor, and a section that appeared to have been set up for some kind of manufacturing or assembly work. This wasn't just a warehouse, it was a compound where people had been living and working, possibly against their will. As Ethan explored the abandoned space, he found something that made his heart race. A bulletin board still hanging on one wall, with photographs and documents that the fleeing occupants had left behind in their haste. Among the photographs was one that stopped him cold. It showed a group of women working at computer terminals, and though the image was slightly blurry, one of the women looked remarkably like his mother, older than when she had disappeared, but unmistakably Catherine. But it was what Ethan found beneath the overturned desk that changed everything. Hidden in the debris was a single photograph that had apparently slipped from someone's hands during the evacuation. It showed a cargo ship docked at what appeared to be an industrial port, with the name Eastern Horizon clearly visible on the hull. On the back of the photograph, written in handwriting that Ethan recognized, was a departure schedule and a partial list of names. At the top of the list, in his mother's distinctive script, were the words Elizabeth C. and Ronald M. Ethan's hands trembled as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just evidence that his mother had been at this warehouse. It was evidence that she might currently be on a cargo ship, possibly being transported somewhere against her will. "Detective," he said urgently into his concealed microphone, "I found something. There's a photograph of a ship called the Eastern Horizon, and I think my mother might be on it." Detective Vance's response was immediate. "Get out of there now and bring whatever you found. We're mobilizing a full response team." As Ethan hurried back to his car, clutching the photograph that might finally explain his mother's 14-year disappearance, he had no way of knowing that miles away, the Eastern Horizon was already preparing to leave port with a cargo that included dozens of people who, like Catherine Dawson, had been trapped in a web of debt and coercion that had stolen their freedom and their lives. The race to save his mother had begun, and for the first time in 14 years, Ethan was running toward her instead of away from the truth. Within hours of Ethan's discovery at the warehouse, the police station had transformed into a command center. Detective Vance had called in resources from multiple departments, and the building buzzed with the controlled urgency of law enforcement officers working against time. "The Eastern Horizon is registered out of Port Elizabeth," Detective Vance explained to Ethan as they studied maritime records on a computer screen. According to Harbor Authority, it was scheduled to depart this morning, but they filed an emergency departure request last night, citing weather concerns. Ethan's stomach dropped. They knew we were getting close. "It appears that way," the detective confirmed grimly. "But we've already contacted the Coast Guard. They're launching helicopters and deploying vessels to intercept the ship before it reaches international waters." The next few hours were the longest of Ethan's life. He sat in the police station, surrounded by the controlled chaos of an active investigation, while his family was contacted and brought in for their own protection. The possibility that Catherine was alive and on that ship had transformed what had been a cold case into an active rescue operation. When Mark, Leah, Ellie, and Aldi arrived at the station, their faces showed a mixture of hope and disbelief that mirrored Ethan's own emotions. Dan was helped from his wheelchair into a more comfortable chair, and for the first time in 14 years, the entire Dawson family was united, not in grief, but in the possibility of joy. "Is it really her?" Ellie asked, studying the blurry photograph that Ethan had found. "After all this time, could Mom really be alive?" "The evidence suggests it's possible," Detective Vance replied carefully. "But I want to prepare you all for any outcome. Even if your mother is on that ship, we don't know what condition she'll be in or what she's been through during these 14 years. Dan reached out with trembling hands to hold the photograph, staring at the image of the woman who might be his wife. "She looks so much older," he whispered, "but it's her eyes. I'd recognize Catherine's eyes anywhere." As they waited for updates from the Coast Guard, Detective Vance shared what the investigation had revealed about Raymond Doss's operation. It was even more extensive and cruel than Ethan had imagined. Doss's organization specialized in targeting people in desperate financial situations, the detective explained. They would offer loans with seemingly reasonable terms, but the contracts were designed to be impossible to repay. When people defaulted, instead of just seizing collateral, Doss would take the people themselves. The victims were forced to work in various illegal operations, manufacturing counterfeit goods, running online scams, even more serious crimes. They were kept isolated from their families through a combination of threats, surveillance, and psychological manipulation. Many victims were told that contacting their families would result in harm to their loved ones. "It's a form of modern slavery," Detective Vance continued. "The victims become completely dependent on their captors and genuinely believe that cooperation is the only way to protect their families." As this information sank in, the Dawson family began to understand what Catherine might have endured for 14 years. Rather than abandoning them, she had likely been trapped in an impossible situation, sacrificing her own freedom to protect theirs. The guilt she must have felt, Leah said quietly, tears streaming down her face. All these years, we thought she left us, but she was probably thinking about us every single day. The breakthrough came at 6 p.m. when Detective Vans received a call that made him straighten in his chair with obvious relief. They found the ship, he announced to the waiting family. Coast Guard helicopters spotted the eastern horizon about 80 miles offshore. They're moving to intercept. What followed was the most tense hour of the Dawson family's lives. They listened to radio communications between the Coast Guard vessels and the command center, following the operation in real time as rescue teams boarded the cargo ship. Multiple individuals located in the ship's lower decks came the crackling voice over the radio. Appears to be a human trafficking operation. We're securing the vessel and beginning victim identification. 20 minutes later, the communication they had all been hoping for. We have a woman here who identifies herself as Catherine Dawson. She's asking about her family. The sound that erupted from the Dawson family was unlike anything the police officers in that room had ever heard. A collective cry of relief, joy, and 14 years of suppressed hope finally being released. Dan collapsed forward in his chair, sobbing with an intensity that seemed to come from the very core of his being. Ellie and Leah held each other, while Mark stood in stunned silence, and Aldi, who had no memories of his mother, wept for the woman he was finally going to meet. But it was Ethan's reaction that moved everyone in the room most deeply. The man who had spent 14 years refusing to give up hope, who had endured the skepticism and sometimes anger of his own family, who had risked his life to uncover the truth, simply sat quietly with tears streaming down his face and whispered, "I knew it. I always knew she was out there." 3 days later, Catherine Dawson walked through the doors of the police station where her family waited. 14 years of separation ended in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity as a mother looked upon the children she had been forced to leave behind. She looked older, certainly. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her face bore the lines of someone who had endured unimaginable hardship. But her eyes, the same warm, loving eyes that had watched over her children's childhood, were unmistakably those of the woman who had kissed them goodbye on a Thursday morning 14 years ago. "My babies," Catherine whispered, and though most of her children were now adults, in that moment they became 5-year-olds again, rushing to their mother's arms. The reunion was everything you might imagine, and nothing like what any of them had expected. There was overwhelming joy, certainly, but also awkwardness, uncertainty, and the weight of 14 years that couldn't be erased in a single moment. Catherine's first concern was for Dan, and seeing him in his wheelchair broke her heart in a way that was visible to everyone in the room. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, kneeling beside his chair. "I'm so sorry I couldn't be here. I'm so sorry for everything you've been through." But Dan, who had spent 14 years blaming himself for her disappearance, simply took her hands in his and said, "You're here now. That's all that matters." As the initial emotion subsided, Catherine began to tell them what had happened, not the full story, which would take months to emerge completely, but enough to help them understand. She had indeed borrowed money from Raymond Doss's organization when no legitimate lender would help with Dan's medical bills. The terms seemed reasonable at first, but the interest rates were designed to ensure that repayment was impossible. When she defaulted, Doss's people didn't just take her as collateral. They made it clear that any attempt to contact her family or escape would result in harm to Dan and the children. "They showed me photographs of you," Catherine explained, looking at each of her children in turn. "They knew where you went to school, what time Dan's physical therapy appointments were, everything about your daily routines. They made it clear that my cooperation was the only thing keeping you safe." For 14 years, Catherine had been moved between various operations, forced to work in different illegal enterprises, while maintaining the hope that someday she might find a way to escape or that someone might find her. The identity of Elizabeth Carter had been created by Doss's organization to help her blend in and avoid detection by law enforcement. The cargo ship had been her latest prison, a floating workshop where trafficked individuals were forced to manufacture counterfeit goods and run online scams. Catherine had been chosen for the ship's operation because of her intelligence and education, but also because 14 years of captivity had taught her that resistance was futile. "I never stopped thinking about you," she told her family through tears. "Every single day, I wondered how you were growing up, whether you were okay, if you thought about me. I kept hoping that somehow you would know I didn't choose to leave you." It was Ethan who spoke for the family when he said, "I never stopped believing you were out there. Mom, I never stopped looking for you." The days and weeks that followed were filled with challenges that no family should have to face. Catherine required extensive medical and psychological care to help her recover from 14 years of captivity. The children had to adjust to the presence of a mother who was both familiar and foreign, who knew them as the children they had been, but not as the adults they had become. There were legal proceedings as law enforcement worked to dismantle the remainder of Harvey Doss's criminal organization. Catherine's testimony, along with that of other rescued victims, helped prosecutors build cases that would ensure justice for the crimes that had been committed. But perhaps most importantly, there was healing, slowly, carefully. The Dawson family began to rebuild relationships that had been fractured by loss and misunderstanding. They learned to trust again, to hope again, and to believe in the power of love to overcome even the most impossible circumstances. As I conclude Catherine Dawson's story, I want you to think about the power of faith in the face of impossible odds. For 14 years, Ethan Dawson held on to a belief that everyone around him called delusional. He refused to accept the easy explanation, refused to give up hope, and refused to stop looking for the truth. His faith wasn't blind or naive. It was based on love, the deep, unshakable knowledge that comes from truly knowing someone. Ethan knew his mother's heart, knew her character, and knew that she would never have abandoned her family willingly. When everyone else accepted the painful but simple explanation of abandonment, Ethan chose to believe in something more complex but more true. Catherine Dawson's story is ultimately about the lengths that people will go to protect those they love. She endured 14 years of captivity, 14 years of forced labor and psychological torture, because she believed it was the only way to keep her family safe. Her sacrifice was invisible to those she was protecting, but it was no less real for being hidden. But this story is also about the power of persistence in the face of overwhelming obstacles. Law enforcement had investigated Catherine's disappearance thoroughly and had reached logical conclusions based on the evidence available to them. It was only Ethan's refusal to accept those conclusions, his willingness to take personal risks to uncover new evidence, that ultimately led to the truth. Think about the people in your own life who might be facing impossible situations. Think about the missing persons cases that remain unsolved, the families who still wonder what happened to their loved ones. Catherine Dawson's story reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply refuse to give up hope. In a world that often encourages us to move on and let go, Catherine's family learned that some things are worth holding on to, no matter how long it takes or how much it costs. Love, faith, and family bonds are stronger than time, stronger than distance, and stronger than the forces that try to tear us apart. Ethan Dawson's 14-year search for his mother teaches us that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to accept that someone we love is gone forever. Sometimes the greatest victory is believing in someone when no one else will. And sometimes, love really is enough to bring miracles into the world. The next time someone tells you to give up on something or someone you love, remember Catherine Dawson. Remember that truth has its own timeline, that justice has its own schedule, and that love has its own power to overcome even the darkest circumstances. Catherine Dawson went shopping for groceries on a Thursday morning 14 years ago and never came home. But love brought her back. Faith brought her back. And a son who refused to stop believing brought her back. In the end, that's what matters most. Not the time that was lost, but the love that endured, the faith that persevered, and the family that refused to be broken by forces beyond their control. Never stop believing. Never stop hoping. Never stop fighting for the people you love. Because sometimes, just sometimes, faith is rewarded in ways we never could have imagined.